Welcome back to our series in the book of Ecclesiastes. This is part 3. You know, from time to time, we change the backdrop here in the studio. And when we do that, we usually do it in between series. And I could have done that this time. We've got a nifty new backdrop. I've never used it. It looks really kind of fun, like a party kind of a thing. If you've watched parts 1 and 2, you know why we haven't changed the backdrop to this. And it's because Ecclesiastes is not a party kind of book. It's actually kind of depressing because we're following a guy named Q. He's a wisdom teacher, and he's explaining to us the quest he's on, but he's also explaining to us the tension that he feels. And if you really read it and you just pause and go with him on the journey, you can feel the angst. And so far we've encountered 2 reasons for Q's angst. Reason 1 is just the quest that he's on. Q is on a quest to find an answer to the question, what do you get at the end of it all? What he phrases it this way, what does a worker get for all of his efforts? What's the prize at the end? And is it a prize that makes it all worth it? Is it something satisfying? Or am I really just playing catch the wind? We talked about that in part 1, where you just go out and you're trying to catch the wind, but it's a game you can never win. Like you try to grab the wind, you get it in your hand, you open your hand, there's nothing there, you missed it, you dropped it, right? And so Q is deeply troubled by the fact that there's no good answer to that question of what do I get, and there's no great alternative to playing catch the wind. We all seem to do it. We all seem to think that we maybe will win, but there's nothing else to do. So next thing you know, we're playing catch the wind again. The second reason that we encountered was observations. Q's observations. Q pointed out there's this tension between what he knows and what he sees. A tension between what he knows by faith, what he believes by faith, and the harsh realities as he sees them. And we talked about that a lot in part 2. There's a third reason for the angst in Q's soul, and it's this: the exceptions. The exceptions. Q is a wisdom teacher. He's incredibly familiar with Proverbs, like the book of Proverbs, right? Do this and this is what will happen. But Q is deeply troubled because there are too many exceptions to the Proverbs. I think Q knows the Proverbs are proverbs. They're not promises. They're probability statements. If you do this, this is what's most likely to happen, right? A soft answer will turn away wrath. But you and I know, not every time. There have been times when somebody was very angry and you spoke to them politely and calmly, and they stayed angry, right? But the probability is a soft answer will turn away wrath. It'll help somebody calm down, and it certainly is way more effective than the alternative, right? A really loud, harsh answer. Nobody, right? They're angry. You yell, "Stop being angry!" And then you, right? That doesn't do it. And so Q is frustrated because he sees these exceptions to the Proverbs, but he can't find any other alternative. He's tried living like a fool. That didn't work. And he knows that following your heart is worse than any of the exceptions on the wisdom path. And so there's this angst, right? Because of the quest, because of his observations, because of the exceptions that he sees. And you'll see an intermingling of all 3 of those as you read through Q's lecture. Parts 1 and 2 of the series. We read every verse because we wanted to get an accurate understanding of Q's message. We wanted to catch his heart as well. We wanted to really understand the angst that he was trying to express. Today we're going to focus on 3 passages from the chapters 4, 5, and 6. We're not going to read every verse. Let's just jump in. We're going to start at chapter 4, verse 9, where Q is talking about the importance of companionship. Ecclesiastes 4:9. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their efforts. Well, there you have it. 2 are better than 1. You get more when there's 2 of you than when there's just 1 of you. It's a better reward. A lot of studies have pointed out the truth of what Q just said. Q continues, "For if either falls, his companion can lift him up. But pity the one who falls without another to lift him up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they can keep warm. But how can one person alone keep warm? And if someone overpowers one person, 2 can resist him." It's reasonable to think that Q has got the idea of travel in mind when he talks about these 3 advantages of having a companion. Journeys were much more hazardous in those days than they are now. For one thing, they went so much more slowly, so it took several days. You were out there, and you could be exposed at night. And in that region of the world, the Middle East, it got really, really hot in the day and really cold at night. So that makes sense of the one advantage you pointed out. They also, because you're gone and you're just out there, you're away from civilization, and you're going to be gone maybe 2-3 days, maybe even longer. You don't have a cell phone, no tow trucks to come get you if you break down, right? Any of that kind of a thing. You're going to have to spend the night, and there are bandits hiding in various places, trying to take advantage of people, rob them, that kind of a thing. And so the journeys, they were hazardous, more hazardous then than they are now. But as I was thinking about it, I think you'd agree with me, the journey through life is no less hazardous now than it was back then. And so just like back then you needed traveling companions if you were going to travel physically, now we need traveling companions, people to do life with if we're going to go through life, because it's hazardous. We need somebody to help pull us back up when we fall. Some of the translations talked about, he says, 2 are better than 1, because if one falls into the ditch, the other can pull him out. You ever been in the ditch of self-pity? Right, something happened and it shouldn't have happened. In the truth, it shouldn't have happened. It was wrong. It shouldn't have happened to you. But you don't just feel it. You feel it. You're stuck there, and you can't seem to get out. You've fallen, and you just can't seem to get on with your life. And so you need a traveling companion, right? So we need someone who will pull us up out of the ditch of our self-pity, or maybe out of the ditch of our perspective. Right? You can only see it a certain way, and you need a traveling companion who can speak truth into your life and can say, yes, that's all true, but have you considered? And can give us a fresh perspective that helps us to get up, get going again. Or someone who just kind of like gives us a little kick right in the pants, like, okay, enough. And then they help us not to give up. He talks about how can you stay warm if you don't have someone to huddle with you. Life is tough. The journey through life is hazardous. And so there are times when we need someone who will huddle with us just to help us stay warm, stay alive. We need someone who will help us resist the attacks that we face. I'm not, in that day it was like attacks, like a bandit came and he was trying to rob you. I think nowadays more the attacks are coming in other ways, and many of the attacks maybe come from our enemy, where he's trying to attack our faith. Maybe he's trying to attack our purity with temptation. He wants to get us caught up in something. Maybe he's attacking our hope, selling us lies, that kind of thing. We need someone who will help us resist those attacks by speaking truth into our lives. And then right at the end of verse 12, Q adds this other thought. He says, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. If 2 are better than 1, 3 is even better yet. And I agree with him. I love being part of a triad. It's awesome. But this leads to some questions that are worth pondering. Like, who are my traveling companions? Who are your traveling companions? Who's doing life with you? Like they're in there, they're actually going with you. They're close enough that they can see when you're struggling. They can see what you need. They can see when you're doing well. They can, right? Who are you doing life with? Who are your traveling companions? And is there an investment needed? Like I need to build into their lives. I need to just get another traveling companion. I've got 1, so there's 2. 2 are better than 1, but 3 would be even better. Is there an investment needed? Is there a change needed? Do you realize maybe you've got a traveling companion who's going to kick you while you're down? I don't know, that kind of a thing. Questions worth pondering. Let's jump to the second passage. This is chapter 5, 1-7, and commentators call this passage "Fools in God's Presence." Q gives his big idea at the end. He says, verse 7, therefore fear God. Right? Q's like, listen, you got to fear God. Like, you got to keep in mind, like, who God is and who you are. And by the way, you're not God. You're not even close to God. So he's like, let me give you 2 pieces of advice, lest you make a fool out of yourself. As I say those words, you caught the sigh. The sigh is because at the time of this recording, yesterday, I was at a wedding. It was a nice wedding. It was a beautiful wedding. The weather was nice. The location was beautiful. The vows were great. It was kind of a fun wedding. They had some really neat things in it. The food was great. The people I was with were great. The problem is, the reason for the sigh is, at one point, I wasn't thinking as carefully as I should have, and in my opinion, at least, I made a fool out of myself. I hate making a fool out of myself. You probably don't like making a fool out of yourself. And as I think about the wedding, I will probably, associate, yep, great wedding, made a fool out of myself. I know as the day went on, I thought a couple times people were looking at me all kind of squinty-eyed, like, who invited him? And whoever it was, they shouldn't have done it. I'm not sure if that was really what they were thinking or not, but it felt that way. This I know. I hate making a fool out of myself, but I know it's a much bigger deal to actually be a fool than to make a fool out of yourself. I would like to think that, yes, I made a fool out of myself at the wedding, but I am not a fool like in all of life. Right? I'm not a fool. I'm not a person who is thinking I can do this and get those results instead. That's a fool. Someone who's like, I know what God expects, but I'm going to do this and I still expect the good things from God. That's a fool. Right? It's a much, much bigger deal to be a fool than to occasionally make a fool out of yourself. Q would say it's an even bigger deal to be a fool when you're interacting with God. And so he gives us two pieces of advice to help us not act like a fool in front of God. Piece of advice number one is watch your step. Chapter 5, verse 1. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do. He's like, look, going to a place of worship is not enough to make you right with God. Your lifestyle, Monday to Saturday, matters. It matters. Obedience. He says, approach in obedience rather than make the sacrifice of fools. Approach in obedience. Like you've been paying attention to how you live. Yeah, you're not perfect. But you're paying attention to how you live Monday through Saturday. You're not thinking like, well, I'll just go to God on Sunday and somehow that'll make up for it all. And God will be like, oh, yeah, that's great. Some of you have been deeply wounded by individuals who did exactly this. They put on an act on Sunday, and I think they believed the act, like that they're okay with God and they're right and everything. And then Monday through Friday or Saturday or whatever, they were not acting like God at all, and it hurt you, hurt others deeply. You weren't fooled. God wasn't fooled. One commentator said this. He said, if you're going to plant your literal feet in the place where God is worshipped, you better make sure that your metaphorical feet have been walking in the ways that God has commanded. Your obedience. So Q says, watch your step. That's piece of advice number one. Piece of advice number two is in verse 2. Don't be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive and to make a speech before God. It kind of reminds me of that scene where the disciples are at the Transfiguration. Let me just kind of tell it in my own kind of wacky kind of way. Jesus invited 3 of his disciples to go with him, and they went up on a mountain, and there Elijah and Moses appeared, started talking with Jesus. God's glory shows up. Jesus' face is glowing. It's this incredible spiritual high, literally. And Peter something comes over him. He doesn't know what to say, but that doesn't keep him from speaking. And so Peter's like, hey guys, I got an idea. Let's build some nice little shelters here because it's kind of hot during the day and everything, and we'll all sit around and we'll talk and enjoy this time together. Yeah, that'd be great. I can see about getting some stuff to build some stuff. That'll be great. And then God speaks and he's like, this is Jesus. Listen to him. And when I read that, I think the connotation is like, we're not here to listen to your ideas, Peter. You're here to listen to Jesus, right? So you do right. Him. You, right. That's what comes to mind. Note the reasons, though, why it is that Q says we should be slow to speak in God's presence. He says, don't be hasty to speak. This is verse 2. He continues, or impulsive to make a speech before God, because God's in heaven and you're on earth. So let your words be few. He's like, you're talking to God. That's great. But keep the physical gap in mind. Like, you're here on earth, God's in heaven. And he's like, keep this in mind, that the gap between earth and heaven, the physical gap, is no bigger than the perfection gap between you and God. God is perfect. You are not. He's like whole different category. You're here, he there. Right? The gap, the physical gap between earth and heaven is no bigger than the gap between the power gap in you and God. Like, you can't, as the New Testament points out, you can't control like the weather. You can't make your height increase. You can't do anything. God can do all that and way, 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 way more. The gap between you and God when it comes to power and ability is at least as big as the gap between earth and heaven. The gap between God's knowledge and my knowledge is at least as big as the gap between earth and heaven. So he's like, listen, God's in heaven, you're on earth, let your words be few. There is, no matter how far you've come, there is an amazing and astronomical gap between you and God. And then he adds a second reason why we might want to be very careful when we're speaking to God. He says, you might get caught up and promise something that you won't be able to deliver. This is verse 4. When you make a vow to God, don't delay in fulfilling it, because he does not delight in fools. Fulfill what you vow. Better that you do not vow than that you vow and not fulfill it. Don't let your mouth bring guilt on you, and do not say in the presence of the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry with your words and destroy the work of your hands? He's like, listen, it's better you just, when you're in God's presence. Now, I don't think Q is trying to make us afraid to worship God. For example, if Q is here, he would probably say, listen, I don't want you to be afraid when you sing a song of dedication to God that you're going to either be a fool or you're going to make a vow you can't keep, even though the song of dedication, like, God, I gave you my whole life, that kind of thing. He's like, listen, I just don't want to be for myself. I don't want to be thoughtless in my worship, and I don't think you want to be either. And Q's like, and I never want to lose my fear of God, and I don't think you want to either. And so I'm saying these things to you in hopes that you'll pause and you'll just think when you're entering God's presence. I'm saying these things so you just will pause and you'll evaluate your actions. Like, how have you been living Monday through Saturday? And you'll evaluate your beliefs. Like, do you have a big enough view of God? Or are you thinking small thoughts of God, like God is small and manageable? Well, he's like, I'm trying to get you to think, because it's a big deal when we don't. Let's go to the third passage we want to look at today. And this one's about wealth and happiness, chapter 5, verse 10 through chapter 6, verse 7. And it appears, as you look at this passage, if you study it out, it appears that Q is very clever. He's trying to focus our attention on one thought, something that he says is good, but he's doing it by placing it at the center of the passage. So a lot of times when we talk, the big idea is at the beginning, or sometimes it's at the end, right? We lay it all out, and therefore, right, I am an awesome person and you should buy me a present, right? Whatever. Q is not doing that. He's not putting the big idea at the beginning or at the end. He's put it at the middle. But to help us focus on that, he structured it so that the ends kind of match. And if you go in one step closer from the end to the center, they kind of match. They're parallel. So let me just show you what we're going to look at. This is a passage about wealth and happiness, and there's a section about futility on both of the ends. One step closer to the middle of the passage is a section about tragedy. And then in the middle is a section about what is good. So let's just go ahead and take a look at it. We're going to start with the ends. Both ends state that a man who wants to be wealthy will never be satisfied. First part, 5 verse 10. The one who loves silver is never satisfied with silver, and the one who loves wealth is never satisfied with income. This too is futile. You see the word futile, you see the word satisfied, never satisfied. That's the very beginning of the passage. Let's go to the end of the passage, chapter 6, verse 3. A man may father 100 children and live many years. No matter how long he lives, if he's not satisfied by good things and does not even have a proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For he comes in futility and he goes in darkness, and his name is shrouded in darkness. Verse 7, all of a person's labor is for his stomach, yet the appetite is never satisfied. So you see at both ends, this idea of never being satisfied and the futility of thinking that wealth is going to do the trick. That if you love wealth and you pursue wealth, you're going to finally find satisfaction at the end of the rainbow. Let's go one step closer to the center of the passage. The front section speaks of a tragedy. This is verses 13 through 17. He tells a story about a man. And the man had some money, and he wanted to pass something on to his son. He wanted to give an inheritance. And so he took his money, and he saw there was this business venture, and he invested all of his money into the business venture because he thought this would be a great way to have an inheritance. Thought he was going to make a lot of money. Lost it all. And so the tragedy is this man is unable to give anything to his son. He has nothing to give. He lost it all. What a tragedy, right? He'd poured, he'd worked, he'd planned, he worked the plan. Boom, at the end, he's got nothing, and he's unable to give. Other side, past the center, just on the other side, chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, Q uses that word tragedy again. But here's a guy who's accumulated a lot. He doesn't lose it. He just doesn't think it's enough. He's never able to enjoy it because he's always driven to get more and more and more. And so in the end, he is unable to enjoy life because he's just so driven. And he's no happier than the guy who had nothing. Now let's go to the middle. Verse 18, Q says, in contrast to all that sickening tragedy and pain, here is something good. Verse 18, here's what I've seen to be good. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of his life God has given him, because that is his reward. Furthermore, everyone to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also allowed him to enjoy them. Take his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God. He says it's good. Q says it's good to enjoy what you have because that means that God has favored you with a huge gift. Oh, what's the gift, Q? What's the huge gift? All the stuff, the house, the cars, the kids, the vacations, the cruises. What's the thing? Q's like, no, none of that. The huge gift that God has favored you with is satisfaction. The ability to be satisfied with what you have and to therefore just enjoy it. He's like, that is the gift. When you think like, oh man, you inherit a bunch of money. Well, that was a gift from God. Like God was so good to me. He favored me. He's like, yeah, God favored you. But it is equally favored. It is a perhaps even greater favor, a rarer favor, to have God give you satisfaction, the ability to be happy with what you have and to enjoy it. We're going to come back to that thought, but let's allow Q to finish. So verse 19 again, this is a gift from God, for he does not often consider the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. Q says this was a gift from God, this whole satisfaction thing, and here's why. Because it makes it so the guy who's satisfied, the guy who's enjoying life, he doesn't often consider the days of his life. Because he's so occupied with the joy of his heart. He's just enjoying family and getting the family together and the holidays and the vacations and the cruises and his pickup truck and hunting and his other hobbies and his money. He's so caught up with that. He's enjoying his life so much that he doesn't ever really stop and think too much about life. Right? Did you catch it? He does not often consider the days of his life. He doesn't think where am I in the timeline and am I getting close to the end? He doesn't think very often about what's after life. like after death. Is there life after death? He doesn't think too much about that. He knows that there are starving children in Africa, and that's got to be horrible, and it's got to be even worse for the mom to watch your kids starving. But he doesn't think too much about that. He doesn't think too much about oppression. He doesn't think too much about the quest. He doesn't think too much about the exceptions to the Proverbs. It's like Q is looking at us, and he would say, listen, blessed is the one who doesn't think too much. Blessed is the one who doesn't reflect on life very much. Blessed is the one who's like so distracted from all that by enjoying all the good things in his life. By the way, I'm not one of those people, Q would shout, right? And you know it. You could tell you're reading the book with me. He would sum it up this way: distraction is bliss. Distraction is bliss. You like the saying, ignorance is bliss? It's a version of that. If you're just so distracted by the good things in your life that you forget there's more to life than this, and a lot of life isn't all that good. And he's like, hooray for you. Okay. So Q says clearly, wealth doesn't produce satisfaction. God decides whether you get that. Let's pause for a moment here. I think Q's spot on. Clearly, wealth doesn't produce satisfaction. That second line, God decides whether you get it. Is Q right? Is Q right? Is satisfaction a gift of God? Like the ability to enjoy things, is that a gift from God? And so if you don't have satisfaction in your life, if you're not pleased with the accomplishments and the good things and the good people in your life, is that somehow on God? Because God gave you this other stuff, but He didn't give you the ability to enjoy it. Is that on God? And is satisfaction, is like that the only way to get it as a gift from God? Or could you do something else to get it? Is there another path? And is satisfaction different from contentment? Because the New Testament talks about contentment, and it says contentment with godliness is tremendous gain. And Paul says he learned how to be content. So contentment seems to be something that you can work at and you can gain. But is Q saying the ability to enjoy, the ability to be satisfied, is that impossible to get unless God just hands it to you? These are the questions I think that are worth pondering. Is Q right? Second thing that Q said was that distraction is bliss. That sounds kind of attractive. I mean, who wouldn't want to be just caught up with how good life is? It sounds kind of American too, kind of, doesn't it? Like that sounds awesome. Where do I sign up, right? I'd love to be distracted, just enjoying all the stuff in my life, and I'm just really not really in touch with the fact that I know there's pain out there, but I'm not really feeling it. And I know there's scarcity out there, but I'm not really feeling it. And I know that there's just tremendous hardship, but I'm not really feeling it. And I know that there are things that can't be answered, and there's mysteries and terrible paradoxes and injustices, but I'm not really feeling it. Is Q right? Like that would be a wonderful state of being. To be right there, to kind of oblivious. Like you know it exists, but it's not impacting you. Is he right? Would that be a great place for a Christian to be, to live? Or is that something you're only supposed to have maybe when you go on vacation? And right along with that, what would we forfeit if we were distracted from reflection? Like we're so distracted by all the good stuff in our life, and that we never really reflect on, well, much of anything. What would we forfeit? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Or is this the kind of thing where we're like, okay, Q, you're right, distraction is bliss, but, and we'd have a huge statement right after that. You got to really pay attention to what comes after the word but. Questions to ponder. Friends, let's wrap up this part in our series. In his lecture, Q is sharing his observations. He's sharing his wisdom. He's sharing his pain. He's giving us advice. He is lamenting and he's lecturing. He is questioning. He's exhorting. Our goal is to listen for a word from the Lord to us coming through Q. Perhaps God is speaking to you today through this portion of Ecclesiastes. If so, that would be awesome. I look forward to joining you in part 4.